All right, welcome back to another episode of the Home Turf Podcast. I'm your host again today, Jordan Epp, the head sports editor here at the Battalion. And this is our last episode of the season. Well, at least for me, because Grant will continue to be hosting more episodes as time goes on. But now that the football season's over, this little part of the podcast that I do my hosting of, we're in our last stage here. And I'm joined today by none other than Peter Raderkus. Go ahead and let us know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. A little bit about me. I am a junior at LSU, and I'm currently the sports editor at the Reveille, our student print publication and newspaper. Going into getting to the end of my first semester as sports editor and third year just on the staff overall.
So you've been there for a little while. So that kind of goes into some questions I'll have for you later. But before we get started, I need to, of course, shout out our sponsor. They sponsor us every single episode. It is Hitch. So for all your ride sharing needs, make sure you check out Hitch. If you're needing to travel across the state, it's like Uber, but it's for longer distances for 30% off your first 4 orders, up to $50 each ride. Use code AggieNews3, AGGIENEWS3. And thanks again to Hits for sponsoring this episode. Now, let's go ahead and get things started on the preview for LSU A&M season finale for both teams. And before we get into that, I want to know what the vibe check is like over at LSU because, outstanding season. You've already locked up the SEC West title. You're already representing the SEC West in the SEC title game. So how are things going under year one and the Brian Kelly season? So just like let us know how things are going over there.
Yeah, I mean, in short, the vibes are great. Just to answer it that way. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I certainly didn't expect, LSU to be in the position that they are now at this point in the season. I remember especially, go back to the Florida State game or really just the Tennessee game where they got, blown out of their own stadium back in October. And I don't think anybody thought that, they'd rattle off wins against, back to back to back whatever wins against Florida, Ole Miss, Alabama, and then just kept going. And, now we're looking at it going into the last week of the season. And one, not only LSU just playing meaningful football, which they have not done at this point in the season since 2019, they've locked up a spot in Atlanta and are now, a win in the championship, maybe a little bit of help if necessary away from, having a college football playoff spot.
That's one thing I kind of wanted to talk to you about was LSU, even though you can kind of look at it as like they have no stakes in this game because they've already got the title berth locked up, there still are some stakes in it for LSU because one, you can't let this game slip. Not that I think that A&M is, the biggest threat on LSU's mind right now, with Georgia coming up soon. But you can't let this game slip because if you beat Georgia, then you have a really good shot of possibly making the college football playoff. Of course, you would become the first ever conference championship, not just conference champion, you'd be the first ever team to make the college football playoff with 2 losses. That hasn't happened before, but things could just shape up that way because you're looking over at, the Big Ten and you look at how Michigan and Ohio State, they're sitting in the top 4. They play each other this week, and one of those teams will not get to play in the Big Ten title game. And so you look at maybe things can just shape out in a certain way that could potentially go LSU's way to go into the college football playoff. So what do you think the odds are that LSU might be able to make it in?
Yeah, so I think if LSU does go to Atlanta and beat Georgia, it's going to be, no matter what happens, I think it would be really hard to keep them out. Because if you look at it in that sense, they'd go in, they would have 2 losses, but you look at the resume, you've got win over Ole Miss, win over Alabama, win over Georgia, and your only losses are to Tennessee, a top. I mean, they've obviously dropped a little bit since that loss, but still a top, 25, top 15 team. And then Florida State, who's kind of snuck their way back into relevancy and back into the top 25. So you don't, obviously the Tennessee loss by that many points at home is not the best look. But if they go on the road, if they go technically not on the road, but go to Atlanta and beat Georgia, if you look at the wins they have, it's hard to keep an SEC champion with those kind of wins out. Now, at the same time, it does a little bit depend on what else happens around college football. Um, I think though with LSU sitting, the college football playoff rankings will be coming out tomorrow, and where everyone's kind of assuming it'll be either LSU or USC that sits at 5. And we obviously already know too that 3 and 4, or 2 and 3 rather, Ohio State and Michigan are going to play each other this week. So one of those teams is going to lose, and you would think that might knock them down at least out of the top 4. You're looking at a situation where if LSU wins, it kind of comes down to LSU and USC, and that's where the committee is really going to have a decision to make. That's also assuming TCU wins out as well, who I think if they just lose one game, they're probably out of it too. So, yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of this part of the season. These kind of discussions. Seeing what are they going to do. So, beauty. Some may call it beauty, some may call it just chaos. It's a little bit of both, but it's one of those things where I think the committee's going to have a decision to make, and it's going to be about what do they value more, strength of the wins that you have, quality wins, or the fact that USC, if they were to win out, would be a one-loss conference champion over a two-loss conference champion.
I mean, you and I, we both are participating in the student media poll. And so I don't know if when you are doing your rankings or anything like that, at this point, I've basically canceled out week 1 for the most part because these aren't the same teams that they were in week 1. Week 1 was a completely different story. And so I look at LSU and I look at a loss at home against Florida State, and I'm really not even thinking about that anymore. Even though we like now know, like, okay, Florida State is a pretty good team. They're probably like a top 40 team in the country. They're not quite like a top 25 team, but they're very solid. They're respectable. But I just don't really even think about that anymore. So now I just think about when I look at LSU, what have they done? And yeah, that would be breaking precedent that has kind of been established that a 2-loss team has not made the college football playoff. But this feels like if there's ever a situation where it's going to happen, it would be this season, especially now that Tennessee has gotten its second loss. And so now you don't really have to worry about like, oh, Tennessee's kind of still up there. They can kind of make things difficult. Yeah, if you beat the presumably number 1 team in the nation, Georgia, in the SEC title game, it's really hard to kind of convince yourself that LSU hasn't earned that title to make it into the college football playoff.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Just like I said, looking at the wins that team would have if you do it that way. Obviously USC, if they went out, they would only have one loss to be a conference champion. But this is just objectively just a much not the same caliber schedule. They would have quality wins against UCLA on the road like they had last week, and then in the Pac-12 championship. But we named them earlier, wins over Alabama, wins over Georgia, wins over Ole Miss. It's gonna be up to the committee to decide, what carries more weight.
And how has the opinion kind of shifted on, as I mentioned, first year under Brian Kelly? He was catching a lot of flack in the offseason, for the cringy videos of him dancing with recruits that would end up going to Alabama. You look at, the press conferences where he's putting on an accent to try and, assimilate into the culture. And it just felt like kind of weird. And everyone was saying that he didn't feel like a culture match for LSU. And that was the whole thing, was they were like, Ed Orgeron, as much as things have gone down with him since then, Ed Orgeron was kind of a very good culture fit for LSU. And they were like, I don't know if Brian Kelly can work in the SEC. And he's shown I can work in the SEC and I can work year 1. So how has the opinion kind of shifted on Brian Kelly?
Well, I think, first of all, if you're talking about, fit and match and culture wise, I mean, I think the biggest aspect of culture at LSU when you're talking about LSU football is winning. The fans are going to get behind and the program's going to get behind a coach who wins. And that's happened so far. And so I think, I mean, yeah, coming in, he was polar opposite from the last coach that was here, obviously. But I think that's kind of what LSU wanted when they were looking at the search. They wanted to find somebody like Brian Kelly, who, might not be a guy that, you're going to go down to the docks and eat gumbo with, but, is somebody who is rebuild programs, and he's already doing that much faster than many people expected here. So I think from the LSU fan base, I don't think there was ever too much doubt and questioning behind the Brian Kelly hire. Don't I mean there were definitely some people who had their concerns or their worries, but I think as it pertains to fit, it was the biggest thing that I was questioning coming into the season was how is he going to get all of these new pieces and players and coaches and all that to fit. And as we saw at the beginning of the season, it did take a little bit of time. You saw the game against Florida State. You saw, the game against Tennessee. But what I've been most impressed with is how he's been able to take a roster, which bowl game last year when he first got here had, I think, 38 scholarship players, build that roster back up through the transfer portal, through some very impact freshmen that and just what he's been able to do with that group since then. And I think just at a place like LSU, when you win, they forget about where you're from. I mean, Nick Saban was from West Virginia. They liked him. They liked him there, and they sure like him in Tuscaloosa as well. So, I think once you start winning, I think people forget about all that other stuff.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned, the culture is winning because I think back to, the start of the season when there was that whole little thing back, there was a back and forth between him and a reporter when the reporter came in late and Brian Kelly's kind of poking fun at her and she kind of goes back about like, oh, like you haven't won yet though. And that's kind of the way that it feels is like ever since then, it's just been like, okay, we're winning now. And so that kind of all feels like water under the bridge. I like how you also mentioned about, how he was going to put together the roster because I look at this team and the number one thing that stands out to me is the performance of Jaden Daniels at quarterback. Coming in from Arizona State, he had kind of an inconsistent time at Arizona State. You look at his freshman year, he was one of the like next guys up. He was a really good passer in his freshman year. And then he kind of didn't do as good in his sophomore year. His junior year was kind of up and down, but he kind of really came along as a rusher. And then you look at him this season, it's felt like he's just kind of put it together. So kind of speak on how Jaden Daniels has been able to assimilate into the offense and how they use him as a weapon in, both fronts offensively.
Yeah, I think with Jaden Daniels, it's really a combination of things that has allowed him to kind of find his form again and almost reinvent himself at LSU. Looking back at his time at Arizona State, he had a really good freshman year where I mean, he was a very high four-star recruit coming out of high school. I mean, he's a very talented player. And he definitely showed glimpses of that, really showed it for a lot of his freshman year. And then obviously sophomore year in 2020, you had the COVID year where in the Pac-12, I think they only played like 4 or 5 games. Arizona State did. And then last year, he kind of struggled a little bit. But if you also look at Arizona State, I mean, that's a program that has really just steadily been on the decline since he's been there. You've seen all the staff turnover there. You've seen the head coach get fired this season. So I think the first thing for him was getting to a more stable situation at LSU. So once you got that, it was about getting around, the right type of playmaker, the right type of coaches. And that's the other thing. I mean, LSU does have a very good receiver room. They do have a lot of very talented playmakers to put around them that, makes any quarterback shot a little bit easier. Um, and I mean, you saw with Jane Daniels, it did like the rest of the team, it did take time. I mean, early on in the season, there were some doubts, there were some concerns. I mean, going into the year, it wasn't even a certainty that he was going to be the starting quarterback. But it was around the midway point of the season, especially the Florida game where he threw for over 300 yards, had 6 total touchdowns. That's when it really felt like, all right, he's fully figured it out. And since then, I mean, he's been one of the top performing quarterbacks in the SEC. I mean, there's a lot of very good quarterbacks in the SEC right now, but he's been a guy who's performed very well in this offense especially the second half of the season.
Yeah, you mentioned the receivers that LSU has. They have a ton of really good receivers at their disposal. I want you to kind of speak on that a little bit, especially because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've talked about this. There was kind of that concern at the start of the season about, was LSU going to struggle this season after the Florida State thing? You looked at, there was a lot of talk about Keishawn Butte and, how he maybe had taken out LSU stuff from his profiles on social media, and people were like, "Oh, is Kayshawn going to ask out?" So, kind of like talk about how that's kind of turned around and how Jaden Daniels has been able to take advantage of the offensive weapons on the team.
Yeah, trying to read college athletes through their social media has become kind of the new game nowadays, and it's almost an impossible game to play, when you look at certain situations. But just like I said, the team as a whole has grown since then. I mean, the receivers are no different, especially Keishawn Boutte. I mean, he's still not the leading receiver on this team. I mean, he's been Malik Neighbors. Has really been kind of a by committee approach as it comes to the receiver room this year. But the biggest thing with Kayshawn, and Brian Kelly talked about this when he got here, even in the spring. I mean, Kayshawn, there were a lot of rumors that he was going to transfer after the 2021 season. And he had the injury, he missed all the spring practice. And so when Brian Kelly was talking to me during spring, I remember him saying something like, we're still in the process of getting him re-engaged. So, maybe that was something that was still an ongoing process during fall camp and during the early part of the fall. But I mean, all signs now point to, that he is engaged. He's playing well. Didn't play in this past game against UAB. He was sick. But has put together some really good games over the back half of the season as well. And then just looking at the receiver room in total, I mean, it's just a room that's very talented. Like I mentioned earlier, Malik Neighbors has led the way this season. A guy that I personally believed was kind of due for a breakout year this year after being hurt for a lot of his freshman year. Brian Thomas is another guy who's contributed. Dre Jenkins, fifth year senior, has kind of been one of the leaders of the group and has been very impressive. And then at tight end, the freshman Mason Taylor, somebody who, a lot of people weren't sure what to expect from. I remember Brian Kelly at the beginning of the year saying, we expect him to pop like Brock Bowers did at Georgia. Now, I don't know how realistic that ever was. He's obviously one of the best tight ends, if not the best tight end in the country. But he's been a guy who's really been, impressive during his freshman season, caught the game-winning, 2-point conversion against Alabama. So, it's LSU's never really had a shortage on playmakers, and this year has been no different, especially as the season's gone along.
And I think even though we're talking about, the quarterback, or we're talking about the receivers and everything like that, I think one of the strong parts of LSU's team is that they're a very good running team because you have assortment of good running backs. And then you also have the legs of Jane Daniels, who we mentioned has really come along as a rusher. So kind of talk about, the different things that LSU can do on the ground that can make things difficult for everybody.
Yeah, the LSU rushing game has been very interesting to pay attention to this year. And I think it does still, even as a quarterback, I think it does still kind of start with Jaden Daniels. He's the team's leading rusher right now. Somewhere in the 600, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but 600 plus yards on the year. I mean, just when you have a dynamic playmaker like him, it's hard to account for a guy who can throw the ball, who can run the ball like he does. But just looking at the running backs, I mean, in terms of depth, they've kind of taken a bit of a hit, especially now that Armani Goodwin, who was a starting running back at the beginning of the year, is now out for the season. But one of the guys who's really stepped up, who's been one of the biggest surprises and most impressive players in the team this year, has been Josh Williams, a guy who was a former walk-on and now has really emerged. I mean, he's the leading rusher out of the running backs on the team. And he's been very impressive. Missed this past game with the knee injury, but he's been very good. Just a very good. If he's the type of guy, if you need 1 or 2 yards, that's the guy you're going to give it to because he's going to get it almost every time. Legs never stop moving. John Emery is another one. He's dealt with some ball security issues. He fumbled twice against UAB this past weekend, but it's a guy who is probably their best big play running back. A guy who's kind of high risk, high reward. He might fumble, but he also might break off a 70-yard run for a touchdown. So so you kind of have to live with both of them. And then Noah Kane is another one who's been impressive. Hasn't seen as many carries, but has been a kick returner for LSU. And then this past weekend, I want to say had 3 touchdowns and had a very good game. So yeah, I mean LSU's rushing attack, it's been very balanced, and I think that's kind of been the strength of it. You have so many different weapons who can do so many different things. I think that's what's kind of been the key to LSU's rushing attack and just being balanced on offense overall.
Yeah, and I always find the LSU rushing attack to be interesting because you look at seasons past and they'll have like the one guy that's in charge. You'll have the Tyrion Davis Price, you'll have the Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But this season, it feels like every time when you go to look at the box score afterwards, you see that it's a different guy that maybe popped that week than maybe another week. And to pull up the numbers on Jaden Daniels rushing, he currently has 740 yards on the season with 11 rushing touchdowns, which would both mark as career high marks for him personally. He ran for 710 last season with Arizona State in 2 more games. So he's off to his best rushing season by far and 5 more rushing touchdowns than he's ever had in a singular season. Now, I wanted to kind of flip the script a little bit and look at LSU's defense. Now, LSU's defense, much like the offense, is just full of talent as always. And one person who I wanted to kind of bring up, just because he was the talk of the town after the last game, talk about Mr. Flu Game himself.
Yeah, I mean, a guy that I'm sure, Aggie fans are probably all too familiar with, given his recruitment from last year. But I mean, Harold Perkins is. You talk about impact players, impact freshmen. I mean, I don't think anyone. There's been few freshmen in the country, I think, who have made as big of an impact as Harold Perkins has in year one. Just for me personally, I don't know that I've ever seen, at least I haven't in a long time, seen as athletic, as fast as just a guy who is just able to really wreck a game as a linebacker. The way they're playing him now, I mean, I can't think of too many guys who are a better QB spy than Harold Perkins. I remember watching the Arkansas game, and Arkansas was playing Malik Hornsby at quarterback instead of K.J. Jefferson. But Malik Hornsby's whole strength is that he's got track speed. He might be one of the fastest guys any position on the roster. And multiple times in that game, I mean, sometimes I didn't have the best angle. Harold Perkins was chasing him down, forcing fumbles. I mean, he's all over the field. His motor is super high. I mean, he's just a playmaker. That's the best way to put it. I mean, I would say the most impactful freshman at LSU probably since Tyrann Mathieu. He's just a guy who finds ways to make plays. He's just somebody you have to put on the field in some capacity. And I think that's been the biggest key to the development of LSU's defense over the season, because early on you weren't seeing Perkins as much. And now kind of since the Ole Miss game, he's been a very steady feature on that defense. And I think that's been huge for them going down the stretch.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Harold Perkins, linebacker freshman for LSU, was a heavy recruit for Texas A&M and kind of flipped late to go to LSU instead. And he's had a really solid freshman season. And you mentioned too, like he's only played about half the snaps as some of the other players on the LSU defense because he was playing kind of in rotation to start the season. And then over the last few games, he's really kind of started to get a starting role and he's really come along and he's played well all season, but he's finally getting his chance to kind of really show himself out. And he really made his mark against UAB when he did the whole, for those who don't know, he apparently had the flu heading into the game, played anyways. And there's this whole thing where Brian Kelly was like, what happened to MJ when he had the flu, and apparently Harold Perkins said, "Who's MJ?" Which I find to be kind of ridiculous. I don't know if you believe that that story is true or not, but I think that's
So
a hilarious story regardless.
yeah, so BJ Ojolari, LSU Jack linebacker, did confirm to us after the game that Harold Perkins knows who Michael Jordan is, but I think he was just, focused on other things at the moment.
Yeah, I find that to be just the most one of the most hilarious stories that I've heard all season long. Now, kind of talk a little bit about some of the other people along that LSU, defense because you look at that team and I think that they're very solid in every aspect. I don't think that there's kind of one spot on the defense that is like the most glaring weakness. But obviously you have watched a lot more LSU than I have. So kind of talk about, what are the good parts on the LSU defense and maybe where are the weaker parts?
Yeah, I mean, kind of cliche, but I think it all starts up front. Coming into the season, LSU's defensive line was arguably the strongest part of their team. And then early on in the season, it took a huge hit. I mean, the first series of the first game, arguably the most talented player maybe on the roster, Mason Smith, tears his ACL. And so that really affected, just because this was a unit that was really good, but not super deep coming into the year. So now you lose, probably your best player, a guy who's just able to wreck things in the middle of the defensive line. But you still another one of the most impressive things on the defense has been how Mekhi Wingo, transfer from Missouri, has really filled into that role. A guy who came to LSU kind of in his role was always interior pass rush, blowing up the launch pad is kind of how he described it. A guy who his stats might not always pop like like some other players, but he's a guy who's going to affect the game on every snap, especially in the pass rush. He's been very impressive. Jaquelin Roy, the other defensive tackle, has been very impressive. Then off the edge, we talked about Perkins, who I kind of been like a hybrid linebacker and jack linebacker. I mean, BJ Ojolari at that jack spot. One of the best players on this LSU team, was leading the SEC in pressures at one point during this season. He has been very impressive. One of the leaders of this team as well. Wears the number 18 jersey. So I think that's where it starts. Behind them, the linebackers have been good as well. Harold Perkins goes into that mix. Micah Baskerville, another senior with a lot of experience, has kind of been what held that unit down. Been very impressive. A guy who, didn't even start in the first game. And now since then has become one of the most important players on the defense. And I think the biggest one of the another one of the biggest surprises of LSU as a whole has been the secondary. This was a team. If you look at them last year, they lost almost their whole secondary. You lose Derek Stingley, top three pick. Eli Ricks, fresh All American his freshman year. He's at Alabama. Cordell Flock goes to the draft. Dwight McGlotherin's now at Arkansas. So you had to replace that entire, cornerback room. And they did it through transfer portal, and they've brought in some really good guys. Jarek Bernard Converse, experienced senior from Oklahoma State, has been very good. Makai Garner, very just very rangy, long defensive back from Louisiana Lafayette, who's been very impactful. Greg Brooks from Arkansas has been a huge playmaker for them at the nickel spot. They've done a really good job at bringing guys in who have been able to contribute right away. It's one of those things with the transfer portal, things can go two ways. It can either be a huge positive or a huge negative if you have a lot of transfer portal guys. And just, I think the secondary is one of the biggest places to look where they've really done a good job just making it all work. So the defense as a whole, I mean, I think all three levels they've been solid, but I would say the biggest surprise has been in the secondary.
And when I look at the LSU defense and I'm thinking about, how A&M is going to match up with them, I think about, for example, we don't know again if Devon Achane is going to play in this next game. We have heard that maybe he'd be out for the season, and we've also heard that maybe he's coming back. This would be the only game left for Texas A&M. So if he's coming back against LSU. But at the same time, it feels like, why would he come back against LSU? There's nothing to prove. He's already going to go to the draft most likely after the season. So why would he, potentially risk his own health for the game against LSU? But at the same time, it's a rivalry game. So maybe there's a little bit of something. But I look at that and I'm looking at, for example, you were talking about Makai Wingo and the way that he's able to impact the middle of the the defense for LSU. And I'm looking at, Le'Veon Moss, and I'm looking at Amari Daniels and the running backs that come behind Devon Achane. And I'm seeing that's a lot more of running up the middle. You don't have that speed to the outside that Devon Achane's able to provide. And so then it makes me worry a little bit more because I look at that front seven that LSU has, and I'm thinking, okay, I don't know if we're going to be able to run the ball as well as maybe we would hope so. You're looking at, for example, how the run game performed against UMass. And yeah, it was a cold, windy, rainy day. The ball was wet. Everyone was kind of slipping around a little bit. But at the same time, you didn't really enforce your will the way that you would want to against a team like UMass in a run game. And so that makes me really think, how are you going to perform against the athletes that LSU provides? And then I look at, again, how we have our freshman quarterback, Connor Wigman, playing. And I wonder how he's going to be able to perform against, a good front seven and then, very experienced defensive back. So how do you think that the defense is going to be able to perform against A&M's offense?
Yeah, we unfortunately did not get the Max Johnson homecoming that I think everybody
Mm-hmm.
was hoping for at the beginning of the season.
Sadly,
But
he's hurt.
yeah, but like you mentioned though, I think the biggest matchup to watch is going to be up front. I think it's going to be all about who wins that battle. I think if Texas A&M is struggles to run the ball or is unable to run the ball against LSU, I think it's going to make it very tough for that offense. And we'll see. I mean, LSU, they've done a good job throughout the season at limiting, some of the very good backs. I mean, they did a really good job against Rocket Sanders at Arkansas. They did a decent job at slowing down Quinshawn Judkins against Ole Miss. And even last week against UAB, obviously not the best team, but Dwayne McBride, UAB's running back, comes into that game with 1,400 yards in the season, and they still did a very good job. I think held them to only 35 yards or something like that. So, this is a defense that has been solid at shutting down, or at least slowing down those type of running backs like that. So I think that's what it's all going to come down to. Texas A&M is going to have to run the ball against this LSU defense, because if LSU was able to just focus on the pass and drop and then, let those pass rushers really come off the edge, I think that's going to make it a very long night for Connor Wigman and the rest of the A&M offense.
And we're unsure about the availability of our star freshman Evan Stewart at wide receiver, and he didn't play much, and I don't believe he played against UMass at all. And you look at, then you're relying on freshman Noah Thomas, who is the third freshman wide receiver who A&M had recruited like the third lowest of them because you have Chris Marshall who's suspended and Evan Stewart who's hurt, and then you look at Anaya Smith who's also hurt, and it's just been kind of a mess all around for A&M offensively when it comes to injuries and suspensions and whatnot. And you're looking at freshman Donovan Green as an option, of course, sophomore Moose Muhammad to continue to be the guy, but you're looking at kind of the people who were the wide receivers 4, 6, tight end to kind of like to start the season, and that's who you're going to have to rely on a freshman quarterback throwing the ball to against LSU. So let's kind of pivot that into what are your expectations for the game? I understand it's a rivalry game, and I mentioned too that LSU is going to have to make sure that they win this game, but I also feel like this isn't the biggest threat for LSU at this point. So do you think that there could, by any chance, be a situation where LSU is like, no, this is a rivalry. We need to make sure we execute on all phases? Or do you think maybe that their minds could be on Georgia a little bit and they could kind of be a little bit loose in this upcoming game?
I think cautious optimism is the best way to describe this matchup from an LSU perspective. Um, I mean, Brian Kelly was saying today, I mean, I know you mentioned, there's a lot of starters who have, dealing with a lot of injuries, players out and stuff like that for A&M. But, talent wise, I mean, the A&M is still a very talented team. That's something that LSU was going to have to be prepared for. That's something that Brian Kelly talked about today. In terms of them not being focused, that's not something I'm super worried about with this team. You saw a bit of a slower, I don't know if I'd say slip up, but a slower performance against Arkansas following the Alabama game. But that also coincided with, you know, what it's starting to look like now, multiple players, coming into that game with the flu, being sick. So I think in this game, I think the team understands, even though it is against an A&M team that has struggled, and it is a game that, for A&M is meaningless, and for LSU, in terms of SEC championship doesn't mean anything. This is still a game that if LSU loses, that really impacts the end of their season and them achieving their goals of getting to the college football playoff. So from a focus point of view, I don't worry about this team too much. My biggest thing is even though I haven't seen much from the A&M offense that truly worries me if I'm LSU, I think that A&M defense is still it's still tough. And I think that's where LSU, I think A&M's best shot in this game, what could make this game interesting if, you really can slow this game down. You get Jaden Daniels out of rhythm, you force a couple turnovers. And once that happens and, both teams are in it, anything can happen. So I think there's kind of two ways this game goes. One, I mean, I think if LSU comes in here, handles business, plays a clean game, I think they can win this game and probably cover what is, I think, a 9.5 point spread right now. But at the same time, if LSU does not, maybe even if they are focused, but they come in, they're playing sloppy, they let the environment, the game get to them, then we could be looking at a very interesting game, because this is still LSU versus Texas A&M. This is still a rivalry game, a game that both teams and both fan bases are going to be up for. So I think it could still very well be a really interesting game.
And I'm glad you mentioned too, like this is something that all the coaches have been saying when they face against A&M is regardless of how A&M's performed, you can't take them too lightly because there is so much talent even at the back end of the roster. Because you're looking at, 3-star, 4-star guys, super good athletes. And so you can't take anything too lightly because there are still a lot of talented players at the bottom. And so I kind of want to bring this into kind of what is your prediction for the game? You mentioned that there might be two outcomes for the game. I'm not going to make you pick a score, but what do you think is your prediction for how the game ends up panning out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be, for me, whenever there's two possibilities, I think it's gonna be somewhere in the middle. I don't think this is a game that LSU is just gonna run away with and blow Texas A&M out in. I think this is gonna be a game where, it's gonna be slow early on. But I think an LSU team that has kind of re-energized itself after a big senior night win over UAB. I think they're not going to come in sloppy. I think they're going to come in focused, ready to play. But I think this is going to be a game where, at least early on, points may be tough to come by. So I've got this game relatively low scoring, but I think overall this is a game where LSU pulls away and could still, despite maybe not, getting a complete blowout, because I think A&M is still too good of a team to just get blown out of the water. I think it's a game that LSU can come in and win by multiple scores if they're, focused and, play a clean game.
Yeah, I could definitely see this being kind of like the Florida game where A&M is kind of right in there into the halftime mark. And then you come out the second half and LSU just kind of puts it together and they just look like the better team. That's the kind of situation that I kind of imagine this going down in. And I would agree. I think this ends up being a 2-score game. I don't really think A&M has a chance to win this game, but you never really know. But at the same time, one thing that you can't underestimate is even though you look at maybe A&M didn't have the biggest crowd for that UMass game, like I mentioned, cold, rainy, windy, people didn't really want to be there. It was against UMass. The team hasn't been good. But against LSU, they're going to pack the house because this is the final game of the season. They're against one of the biggest rivals at A&M. And so I still imagine that this is going to be a like rowdy and raucous environment in the end. Now, is there anything else you wanted to kind of say about LSU that maybe we didn't get to touch on throughout?
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say, I mean, you mentioned the crowd. Selfishly, I am very much looking forward to, seeing Kyle Field at full throat for the first time. But yeah, I mean, I think just, with LSU, I'm expecting this to be, records aside, I think this is going to be an interesting game. You put two rivals against each other. I think this game in the Iron Bowl, I think are kind of similar this year in that, obviously one team record-wise doing much better than the other, but you just never know what can happen in games like this. So I think we still have an interesting, at least the possibility of an interesting game on our hands on Saturday.
I think rivalries have a really good way of erasing records from the math of what's going on. Now, before we go ahead and go, let people know where they can find you in case they're curious to learn more about you or about LSU.
Yeah, for sure. So my Twitter, you can find me in the Reveille on Twitter. My Twitter is at Peter_Routerkus. And then Reveille Sports is where you will find all of our Reveille Sports content. And that is just at Reveille Sports. Reveille is Reveille.
And thank you again so much for joining me for today's episode. Thanks to all the listeners who are listening. I'm super sad that this is the last one that I'm going to get to do and that I don't get to do a bowl game because, A&M. But I'm super happy about this. Make sure you check out some of the other podcasts on the Battalion Network. That includes Calculated Culture, our Life and Arts podcast, and as well as the Bat Signal, which is our news podcast. So thank you all for joining me. And I was going to say I'll see y'all next time, but sadly I won't see y'all. But you will be able to see some more of the content here at Home Turf going forward. And I'm super excited to see where everything goes. Thank you again for joining me and have a great day and have a great Thanksgiving.